A four-sentence memo, signed in a sealed cabinet room in Ottawa, has thrown global markets into gridlock. On July 8, 2025, Canada issued its first formal restriction on U.S. foreign market access since NAFTA's signing in 1994. The order halted all federal-level procurement from any U.S.-based company not operating on Canadian soil. Overnight, $14.8 billion in U.S. contracts were frozen. The first casualties weren't symbolic. They were operational. Calgary's transit expansion lost its American electrical supplier. Hydro-Quebec suspended a turbine contract with an Oklahoma firm mid-invoice. Toronto's Joe Rail announced project delays, citing changes to supplier integrity protocols. Within 6 hours, the Canadian dollar surged 1.3%, while the S&P/TSX Industrials Index jumped 2.1%. A clear signal. Confidence at home, confusion abroad. Donald Trump was briefed at 4:42 a.m. Washington time. He reportedly slammed the table hard enough to spill a mug labeled America First. Retaliation had arrived, but the method, timing, and structure defied Washington's expectations and may have permanently rewritten the rules of North American economic warfare. Just 34 days earlier, on June 4th, Trump had doubled steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%, invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. The stated reason, national security. The reality? 41% of U.S. steel imports came from allies, Canada, Mexico, and the EU, now cast as economic threats. The contradiction: America used a Cold War-era clause against NATO's founding members. Canada had options: a WTO challenge, a G7 petition, or back-channel diplomacy. It chose none of them. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a doctrine that skipped protest in favor of strategic exclusion. In essence, if the U.S. insisted on penalizing Canadian metal, Canada would block U.S. access to its industrial future. Washington's steel lobby didn't see it coming. Neither did Boeing, which had just secured a $2.4 billion Canadian airframe parts deal. The cancellation notice hit at 9:12 a.m. Eastern, just as Boeing's stock opened. It dropped 5.1% within an hour. Dubbed the Reciprocal Access Framework, Canada's new policy mandates that any foreign firm bidding on public contracts must maintain at least 50% of its manufacturing footprint within Canada or a formal free trade partner. No exceptions, not for defense, not for energy, not for legacy U.S. paper or aerospace suppliers. The policy introduces a three-tier compliance mechanism: origin traceability to prevent parts from being rerouted through third countries, domestic labor audits to enforce local hiring ratios, raw material sourcing certifications. All bidders are subject to quarterly reviews or risk being frozen out entirely. This isn't a tariff. It's market denial. And in a federal procurement economy worth over $120 billion annually in Canada alone, the long-term consequences outweigh any short-term tax or tariff. Back in 2018, the Trump administration issued Executive Order 13881, requiring maximum use of American-made steel and iron in federal procurement. That document, once held up as a model of economic nationalism, is now being mirrored by Canada's Build Domestic First doctrine. The irony is sharp. Canada's retaliatory tool is based on American policy. In trying to exclude allied exports, the U.S. may have inspired the very mechanism now blocking its own market access. Even more paradoxically, Canada's directive leans on the same legal rationale Trump used: the national security of critical infrastructure supply chains. Effectively, both countries are using the same legal framework to justify opposing exclusions, but only one is doing so while still honoring its free trade obligations. According to trade scholars at McGill University, this isn't just retaliation. It's a rules rewrite. Unlike past disputes, where countries retaliated with tit-for-tat tariffs, Canada embedded long-term incentives into its exclusion. Ottawa simultaneously launched an $11.2 billion co-financing pool for foreign firms willing to relocate manufacturing to Canada. South Korea's POSCO signed memorandum to move cold-rolled steel processing to Ontario. Siemens began exploring a power tech facility in Manitoba. The goal isn't revenge, it's reindustrialization. Canada weaponized U.S. exclusion to become a magnet for foreign investment. This isn't a tariff war. It's a competitive redirection backed by legislation, capital, and strategic timing. The freeze hits U.S. suppliers hardest, especially those without any presence in Canada. But for U.S.-headquartered multinationals that already operate north of the border, the door remains open. GE, Ford, and GM still qualify under the new rules because their Canadian plants meet the localization thresholds. Smaller American suppliers, however, with no footprint in Canada, have effectively been locked out. Meanwhile, foreign competitors are benefiting. Bosch, which has operations in Kitchener, secured a $64 million component contract just 2 days after the directive took effect. Japanese manufacturers like Komatsu have already fast-tracked compliance plans. China, notably, is watching but not yet engaging. The result? Canada hasn't merely punished its economic adversary. It has redistributed the opportunity to competitors more agile under origin compliance rules. In Washington, Trump's team had expected Mexico to align against Ottawa. That didn't happen. President Claudia Sheinbaum declined to condemn Canada's move. Instead, she issued a carefully worded statement affirming what she called Mexico's sovereign right to pursue a parallel industrial strategy. The EU's response was quieter, but arguably more strategic. Brussels accelerated the 2030 Green Steel Accord and extended a formal invitation to Canadian firms for joint venture discussions. In a show of confidence, Finland's Adaku, a major stainless steel supplier, announced a feasibility study for new operations in Nova Scotia. Meanwhile, the U.S. challenge at the WTO has stalled in procedural deadlock. Washington filed a complaint alleging unjustified market discrimination. Canada responded by citing the U.S.'s own use of Section 232 tariffs as a legal precedent. The WTO tribunal deferred a hearing pending clarification of national security exemptions in bilateral procurement law, a process expected to drag on for at least 14 months. In other words, multilateralism blinked. Canada's bilateral exclusion held. And at this point, time is on Ottawa's side. The effects are already being felt across the U.S. Midwest. As of July 9th, the American Iron and Steel Institute reported a 9.3% week-over-week decline in cross-border orders. Oshkosh Defense warned of possible layoffs linked to a stalled contract in British Columbia. Steel Dynamics paused expansion plans in Indiana, citing North American procurement instability. Even companies technically exempt under Canada's new framework are uneasy. Ford's Canadian operations meet the new localization requirements, but their Michigan-based suppliers, who feed into those operations, may be excluded from future bids unless they also establish a Canadian footprint. Republican governors from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin have called for what they're describing as retaliatory clarity. But the Trump administration remains committed to its tariff hike, for now, pending the development of new downstream exemptions. There is no consensus, only collision. Prime Minister Mark Carney insists this is not protectionism, it's protection. In a July 8th press conference, he stated, "We are not closing our markets. We are conditioning access to them. If the United States imposes a barrier, we are adjusting our alignment in real time." That framing isn't just rhetorical, it's strategic. By avoiding direct tariffs and instead using procurement exclusions paired with localization incentives, Canada sidesteps most WTO violations while preserving leverage. The Financial Times described Canada's approach as economic aikido, redirecting an opponent's force without striking directly. But not everyone is convinced. Critics within Canada warn that cutting off long-standing U.S. suppliers could trigger downstream disruptions, particularly in sectors like rail and construction equipment. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has called for a dual compliance carve-out that will allow hybrid U.S.-Canadian firms to remain eligible for contracts. For now, however, Ottawa is holding firm. And here lies the central contradiction of this dispute. North America's supply chains were designed to be invisible, flowing freely across borders, guided only by cost and efficiency. Now they're being color-coded by nationality. When the U.S. declares Canadian steel a security threat and Canada reclassifies U.S. suppliers as non-domestic, the result isn't sovereignty, it's fragmentation. The very integration the USMCA was intended to preserve is now being disassembled for strategic ends. Yet both countries continue to insist they're protecting industrial resilience. So what's really at stake isn't just steel or aluminum. It's whether this kind of fragmentation builds strength or erodes the very system that made North America competitive in the first place. Steel was just the ignition. What's being tested now is the viability of a new trade blueprint, one where access to markets depends on geopolitical alignment, local production, and verifiable supply chains. And if Canada's model proves successful, and early signs suggest investor confidence is growing, others may follow. Australia has already floated a similar localization rule. India is considering procurement nationalization in response to U.S. tariff pressures. In trying to isolate foreign materials, the United States may have inadvertently triggered a global reset in trade norms, where even allies no longer assume automatic access, but must now earn it. So, what do you think? Is Canada's steel firewall a forward-looking model of industrial resilience, or the beginning of a dangerous unraveling of global supply logic? Will other allies replicate it, or will this spiral into tit-for-tat escalation? Drop your take in the comments below.